The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by MassMutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. MassMutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a MassMutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Formula One used to have so many cars trying to make it onto the grid for a Grand Prix that it had to come up with a system that sent the worst of them home before Friday practice had even begun. On this episode of Bring Back V10s, brought to you by the race, we're looking back at Formula One's colourful pre-qualifying era from 1989 to 1992. We'll explain why it happened and tell some of the more bizarre stories from that period, and look at the wider reasons behind a period when F1 was very different to how it is today. We're only a couple of weeks away from our series finale, where we'll be answering your questions on anything to do with F1 from 1989 to 2005. So make sure you get your questions into @WeAreTheRace on social media using the hashtag BringBackV10s. We've had a lot of questions in already, but we're going to do whatever we can to get through all of them very, very soon. I'm Glenn Freeman, and joining me for this look back at a weird and wonderful time in the history of Formula One backmarkers are Matt Beer and inevitably Ed Straw. So Matt, before Ed hoovers up an entire episode's worth of memories in his first answer, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you when you think of pre-qualifying in F1?
Discovering that there could be a Formula One team as useless as life was. I came across pre-qualifying. I got into F1 properly in the early 90s, just after this had finished, then bought every second-hand book on the subject in the world, and learning that the Life W12 even happened a mere 2 years earlier was quite shocking for me in my teens.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of that in this episode, those kind of, how did this actually happen? How did these teams turn up at Grand Prix and expect, or sometimes even make it onto the grid? So Ed, try and keep it short, which is probably the biggest challenge you've ever had, as I know we're firmly in Ed Straw territory here, F1 backmarkers, and some of the worst F1 backmarkers as well. So if you can, briefly sum up this period and what it means to you.
Well, pre-qualifying, it's wonderful because it's a microcosm of F1 in that era. You've got heroic failures, these improbable feats of driving, embarrassing shambles, comedy catastrophe, spectacularly misguided projects, some of the worst Grand Prix cars ever made, controversy, just so many stories didn't get the airtime they deserved. And it was also just this most brutal manifestation of F1 at its most intense, usually for those who are the least well equipped to actually take part in it. So what's not to like about it?
Yeah, it's incredible. And a lot of those stories are going to get the airtime they deserve today, basically 30 years on. So, yeah, if you like F1 backmarkers and rubbish F1 teams, this episode is definitely for you. So during this era, early on a Friday morning on Grand Prix weekends, we had pre-qualifying. And at times, as many as 9 drivers were eliminated from the event before 10 a.m. on a Friday. And that's when the others would come in and get to work on a real race weekend with free practice. So this was a crazy time for F1. We peaked at 39 full-time entries for the first season of formalised pre-qualifying, which was 1989, which fits nicely with our 1989 to 2005 Bring Back V10s bracket. This was a time when we had a lot of cars trying to make the grid because we had a lot of ambitious team owners still trying to make it in Grand Prix racing and believing that they could on quite small resources. The majority of them failed, as we'll come to quite shortly. But we did end up with some good drivers in particular having to try and get terrible cars onto the grid. And we will say that this period had a big impact on shaping what we could call the more closed shop F1 that followed and that still exists today. Before '89, when we had a proper pre-qualifying session, we had a little bit of it in 1988, but you could actually trace pre-qualifying back to the 1965 South African Grand Prix, which is way before our time, so we won't be doing that just yet. But in '88, we had 31 cars entered, and there was a group that were considered the pre-qualifiers, and the slowest of those from free practice on a Friday morning would be eliminated on the spot. So, Ed, you could consider that '88 was kind of the prototype and the beginning of what became the pre-qualifying era we're about to focus on, because we had the same unfortunate group of cars were at risk on every weekend, and we're trying to get through during the first practice session.
Yeah, there was 5 of them that had to pre-qualify that season in FP1. The new Real team with Andrea de Cesaris, a couple of EuroBruns, Stefano Modena and Oscar Larari, Gabriele Tarquini, who we're probably going to talk about quite a lot as this podcast goes on in a Sol Coloni, Alex Caffi for Scuderia Italia. And you just had this great story at the start of the season because Formula One was tightening up its organisation and you couldn't just not turn up for races. So Scuderia Italia had to go to the first race in Rio in some form. Its Dallara chassis wasn't ready, so Caffi was driving around in an F3000 Dallara, unsurprisingly 9 seconds off the fastest of the pre-qualifiers, and so he went home. Once they got their proper car, it was normally Tarquini or Larari in the EuroBrun who missed out on the cut. But this is kind of where they started to formulate the idea for a proper standalone pre-qualifying session, and during the season they start to discuss the whole idea of making it into what it becomes.
Yeah, so pre-qualifying wasn't brand new when it came to 1989, and it was part of a raft of rule changes which came in because, there was a growing realization that the number of cars entered into each Grand Prix was spiraling out of control, and that there were fears at one point that we'd have as many as 40 cars trying to get onto a 26-car grid, with teams such as Onyx, First Racing and Atmos expected to join for 1989. So when the formalised pre-qualifying plan for 1989 was announced the previous summer, it originally called for a completely separate event to be held at a different circuit a week or more before the race, which, if you can think of bad things to do for teams that have no money and hardly any people, sending them somewhere else the week before the race they're trying to get into would definitely be high on that list. But this was because a regulation had come in for 1989 that prohibited a circuit hosting an international event in the 50 days before a Grand Prix, or any event at all in the 2 weeks before. So this was a massively controversial talking point at the time. And Lamberto Leone, a former Grand Prix driver who ran First Racing, suggested that there were nefarious motives behind this. And he said, "It's terrible for a new team and very expensive. If we were to make the same decision again now, then perhaps we wouldn't do it. I think FISA and FOCA, which are the governing bodies at the time, are pushing to try and prevent new teams from entering," which is kind of where I think F1's got to today. But this was a time when Formula One started to realise that as the professionalism increased at the front of the grid, it needed to do something about the back of the grid. So rules were brought in demanding that every team had to run 2 cars, and the wording was that a most careful selection of the candidates shall be operated in order to ensure that the competing teams meet all the standards required by the FIA. Classic FIA speak there, if ever I've seen it. So, Matt, why were there so many teams, chancers almost, trying to get into F1 at this period? How did we end up in a situation where, the FIA was genuinely afraid of more than 40 cars trying to turn up for a race weekend?
It does seem bizarre in retrospect that the most dominant F1 season ever in 1988 was followed by a load of new people going, yeah, we could get the hang of that. That looks fairly straightforward after McLaren's just won 15 out of 16 races. But it is actually, when you look back into this, it's quite hard to actually trace the origins of that. It wasn't like there was a rule change that particularly helped, but then the end of the turbo era made it a bit more democratic on the engine front. You could go and buy a Cosworth, you go and buy a Judd. Cosworth was even doing some quite decent deals for upgrading the previous year's engines as well at a relatively cost-effective price. So for teams that have been successful in Formula 3 or Formula 3000, F1 looked a bit more achievable budget-wise, even if a team at the front like McLaren looked so far out of reach. The world wasn't in a bad place financially, relatively. It was a non-recession era before things went downhill at the start of the 1990s. And like you've touched on, F1 was getting more organised at the time as well, and the promotion of it was getting better. Alongside that, it was expanding more in TV terms as well. Satellite TV was kicking off. I think it was on Eurosport at the time as well. So there were a few things that were making F1 as a business to be in look more attractive at the same time that the engines were getting a bit more accessible, even if at the front of the grid, actually getting to a race-winning status looked harder than ever.
I think that the thing Matt touches on there with the turbo rule change, there was this feeling at the time that this new rules for 1989 would transform Formula One and make it much more easy for people to compete, etc. Where have we heard that before? That's always what happens when there's big rule changes designed to make things a bit more equal. So not only did it encourage people to come in, not just in '89 but in the few years before, but also perhaps those who were already there to hang on longer than perhaps was sensible in the hope of getting into this bold new era. But of course it never quite worked out like that. But it was just that combination of stars aligning and everybody just wanted a piece of the action ultimately, because people saw people making money. This was the point where Bernie Ecclestone was helping people like Frank Williams and Ron Dennis, who've been around for a while, rake it in, and they thought, oh, we could do that. And of course a lot of them couldn't.
No, as we would go on to find out. So common sense prevailed, and we didn't do the separate event at a different circuit. Although imagine them having their own standalone event somewhere. That'd be absolute heaven for Ed, wouldn't it?
I'd have paid for tickets.
Yeah, you'd have been the only one. So they end up deciding that the only way they can do this is to give the pre-qualifiers their own 1 hour session first thing on a Friday morning. So from 8 till 9 a.m. before free practice, these pre-qualifiers have to go out. And at that point, 4 would go through, and that's just to become part of 30 cars trying to get onto the 26 slots on the grid. So they were still at risk of not making the rest of the weekend. So at the start of '89, first didn't make it with a car that was designed by Riccardo Di Villa, who very recently passed away. And the Atmos project didn't happen. And then Philippe Streff had a horrendous accident in testing at Rio, which left him paralysed. So we had 38 cars at the season opening Brazilian Grand Prix. And then that was up to 39 when Tarquini took over Streff's AGS for the second round at Imola. The 13 best teams from 1988 avoided pre-qualifying, although Scuderia Italia, AGS, Coloni and Real expanded from 1 to 2 cars, and their new entries were in pre-qualifying. And they were joined by 2-car entries from Acela, Onyx, Zakspeed, and the returning Brabham team, and then a lone EuroBrun of Gregor Wojtek. So there were 13 drivers gunning for those 4 slots. And as I say, you could get through and still be one of the 4 drivers that would then miss out in the proper qualifying. Philippe Alliot, a driver who ended up in these sessions later in 1989 when LaRousse got bumped down because the pre-qualifying teams were reassessed halfway through the year. And he gave a quote at the time saying, "No one can possibly realise what an unbelievable experience it is having to pre-qualify with the intensity and the tension. You can be sure of absolutely nothing." Ed, you and Matt have both done a lot of research going back over this time in F1 and you know the interviews that the people who were involved gave. And I think one thing that really comes across is just how stressful it was. And you know, do you have some sympathy for what these guys were being put through?
Oh, definitely. It was hugely stressful. You didn't have the chance to ease your way in. You had to go straight into this competitive sudden death situation. You'd be on a track that was not very clean often. Sometimes on some of the temporary tracks, it was in terrible condition. And at the start of the session, it would be really, really slow. So at the same time as trying to get your eye in and trying to dial your car in, you've got to try and hold back a bit. So you've still got fresh rubber for when the circuit's at its quickest. These teams are normally parked somewhere not particularly well equipped, because one of the reasons they had to have pre-qualifying was there wasn't enough garage space for everyone, let alone being able to run all the cars on track at the same time. So you weren't in ideal circumstances, and you were just sort of battling away, just trying to get a lap time. And then half the time, because these teams were so small and struggling, you'd have failures and that kind of thing. You could have someone blocking you on a good lap. You might break down and try to get back for the T car, but How do you get back to the pits in time? So there was just so little time to adapt to these things. And then, of course, the madness kind of continued, because even if you pre-qualified, very often you then have to move your whole team into a garage, sometimes into a garage with another team doing exactly the same thing at the same time, which is a recipe for chaos. And there's stories of, in this period, people would get through pre-qualifying and they'd miss a huge chunk of the first practice session because they just didn't have time to move, get set up and be ready for the next practice session. And then, of course, if you miss the first practice session in those days, you then go into the first qualifying session in the afternoon where you're trying to put a time on the board to have a chance of getting into the race. So from all angles, it's just this horrible situation. And if things go wrong, even if you're quick enough, you can't set the time, and then you're out and you're done, and that's the end of your weekend.
And the other thing as well is it wasn't necessarily the 6 or so slowest teams that were in pre-qualifying, because the pre-qualifying group was based on the previous season's results in the first half of the year. This was a whole new set of cars in most cases, so quite often there were long streaks where you had one team dominating pre-qualifying with a car that really should have been allowed on pure merit to go straight onto the grid. And then cars that wouldn't pre-qualify would actually, their pre-qualifying times on this Friday morning session would be quicker than people would actually produce on Saturday afternoon in the end. So it wasn't necessarily democratic, and they were doing it on a filthy track. There's one Canadian Grand Prix in 1989. They'd actually washed part of the track just before pre-qualifying, so they had to use wet tyres, even though most of the track was dry, because part of it was saturated where they cleaned it. So yeah, it was brutal, and it wasn't entirely meritocratic either, but it was fun to look back on.
So you basically have one of 3 scenarios as a driver. Either you're in a quick car and you've got to hope it doesn't break. You're in a terrible car that's going to fall apart and go really slowly, or you're in a car that's right on the cusp and you've got to turn in the lap of your life even to have the chance to qualify for the race. So there's lots and lots of ways to lose in pre-qualifying, no ways to really win.
Yeah, the injustice of it all. Now, we are going to do this episode slightly differently because, as you know, if you've been listening to everything we've done so far, and if you haven't, why are you only joining us now? You've got 7 episodes to catch up on. We normally go through a story chronologically, but we're going to bounce around a little bit all over the place here because as much as Ed would love to go through every single pre-qualifying session and analyse them all in great depth, there just isn't the time. So Matt and Ed are going to pick out some of their favourite stories from this time, and we'll start in 1989 with a combination. As Matt hinted there were drivers and teams that probably had no business being in this session for the backmarkers, and one of those in 89 was Brabham, which had Martin Brundle and Stefano Modena as its driver lineup. This was a very credible F1 team. But Ed, it ended up in pre-qualifying in 89 because it had a slightly quirky existence in the latter part of the 80s, hadn't it? And it paid the price actually for not being on the grid at all in 88.
Yeah, it had this quite quick decline as Bernie Eccleston, of course, who owned it, was becoming less and less interested in his team, which, of course, had won championships in 81 and 83 with Nelson Piquet, and he was focusing much more on running the whole show. And then he basically pulled the team out in 1988 and was trying to sell it. There was this long saga about who was going to buy it. There was talk about Alfa Romeo getting it. It was eventually sold to a Swiss businessman, Joachim Lüthi, I think via EuroBrun, who was involved in the EuroBrun team that was also in pre-qualifying. So this was a reactivation of a team under new ownership. Hence, it was pretty capable. It was a ready-to-go team despite the year out, and it just had one of those situations where it had a quick car and was often the quickest car in pre-qualifying, but still they suffered many of the pitfalls that you face in pre-qualifying.
Yeah, there were 2 races where Martin Brundle, who was generally the pre-qualifying pace setter, didn't even get onto the grid, but those ironically followed Brabham's best race of the season in Monaco. That particular Monaco story is it really sums up pre-qualifying best. So there was confusion about how many cars would even go through pre-qualifying on that weekend, because it was the race that followed Gerhard Berger's terrible accident at Imola, so Ferrari only had 1 car entered. In theory, that the pre-qualifying contenders thought, okay, that means 5 spaces on the grid for us rather than 4, as that was the rule that had been applied in Brazil when AGS only had 1 car because of Streff's accident. So they thought they were fighting for 5 places, not 4. And then it turned out as the weekend went on that the ruling was going to be, no, it was still just 4 places. They were going to do just 29 cars in qualifying. So Brundle had quite a tough pre-qualifying, was 4th fastest by the skin of his teeth, just 0.021 seconds over Pierre-Carlo Ginzani's Ozella. At the time, didn't think that necessarily mattered because both him and Ginzali were going to make it to qualifying. And then Ginzali was told, no, you're actually not going through. We're enforcing the rules differently this weekend to how we did it 2 months ago. But then Brundle and his teammate Stefano Modena showed what the Brabham could do when they got into qualifying. Brundle was 4th on the grid, Modena was 8th. They both Modena ended up on the podium, but Brundle really should have been. He drove an outstanding race. He was hassling Nigel Mansell's Ferrari for the first half of it. A battery problem made he had to have a pit stop for a complete battery change. Rejoined in 10th and actually was pulling off excellent overtaking moves around Monaco to get back to 6th. So that was the caliber of team and driver in pre-qualifying, capable of doing that sort of race in Monaco. And then he failed to qualify for 2 of the next races. Failed to pre-qualify for 2 of the next races. In Canada, this session that started with the track being soaked, then got disrupted by Gregor Wojtek having a massive crash. Brundle had car problems at the start and thought he was going to be okay, but then got knocked out by a great lap from Alex Caffey. And then in the next race in France, he managed to break his clutch master cylinder with a really vicious trip over a curb when running wide at Paul Ricard. And that was enough to mean he didn't partake in the rest of the weekend at all. And this was a car that had been fighting for a Monaco podium about a month earlier.
Back when Paul Ricard actually had curbs that the cars would notice if you drove over them, and runoff areas. So that's the example of a good team that was in pre-qualifying. Let's move on to a team in some ways just as memorable as Brabham, but for all the wrong reasons, because pre-qualifying was the stage for which the Life team was able to get on track on a Grand Prix weekend. Hopeless 1990 entry. Now, before I throw this one over to you guys, Ed, you've looked through how the team fared in each of its sessions that year, and to do this justice, I've got to read them all out. So this, we won't do too much of this, but we've got to do it for Life. So at Phoenix, it did 4.5 laps. The black box failed; it didn't have a replacement. Interlagos, the car failed on the outlap. A connecting rod in the W12 engine went. Didn't complete a lap at Imola. An oil pump belt failure damaged the engine, having got all the way up to 3rd gear. In Monaco, it did 8 laps, and then the engine went on. I mean, you've written here quick lap. That's generous, isn't it? Canada, lots of electrical problems. Car stopped on track after 7 laps. Mexico, engine failed on outlap. France, fuel pump failure on outlap. Silverstone, 8 laps, engine failed. Germany, 5 laps. Then they tried to make a suspension tweak that was not completed in time. Hungary, 5 laps, engine failed. Belgium ran only in the last 10 minutes. And, I mean, on the notes, I'm going to read it out. It says tugged. And if we get through the rest of this episode without using that phrase again, we all deserve a medal. Italy, 2 laps, engine failure. Portugal switched to the Judd engine, only got it started at the end of pre-qualifying, and then the engine cover fell apart when it got on track. Spain, 2 laps completed, engine failed. Ed, where would you like to go with this one?
Well, Life is not only the comfortably the most fun, the gold standard of dreadful F1 teams, but it is symptomatic of this era because you've got all the ingredients. You've got an owner who thinks he's going to be able to make a load of money out of it. Initially, he wanted to be an engine supplier only, and then decided, well, let's start this team then, seeing as they couldn't convince any of the teams to take this Life W12 engine, which had been designed by Franco Rocchi, who was a Ferrari engine guy, so not without a track record. But it was just completely unprepared. They got this first racing design that, as we mentioned, was Ricardo De Vere, the late Ricardo De Vere. I mean, he disowned it by this time because he'd done the initial designs for the first car, but as it gradually moved through its incarnation as the first car, which did get built, and then the Life, it was not what he designed. It wasn't a well put together car by any stretch of the imagination. And then you've got all these just examples of incompetence. They got to Phoenix and they had to borrow a tyre pressure gauge off EuroBrun. Gary Brabham, who was kind of a bit of a rising star at the time, walked away after 2 races. His manager complained about the lack of professionalism. Eventually, they got Bruno Giacomelli in, basically because he was somebody who'd been out of Formula One for a long time, proper driver Bruno Giacomelli, but he was desperate to get back in, and they offered him actual money. They never paid him, but they, as far as I understand, but they did offer him money, and it just never came together. And that it was just this constant optimism that things would be sorted out. And yeah, the W12 engine was a problem, but they switched to the Judd, which, you know, they could put it in the car and should have been able to run it, but they couldn't even do that successfully. So you've got all the ingredients. They couldn't run it. They didn't have the people. The technical director left really early on, Franco Rocchi, and just everything was an absolute mess. And that's why people just remember this, because if you look at the lap times, they never set a lap even vaguely close to looking like it could get on the grid. You know, Bruno Giacomelli could have done the greatest lap in Grand Prix history, and he would have been nowhere near making the cutoff. So everything was just hilarious, and apparently it made a really dreadful noise as well, which is when it was working. So it ticks all the boxes for comedy failure.
It just sounds fictional, doesn't it? Looking now, the fact the team was called Life, which is a ludicrous name to start with. The engine was a configuration no one else would ever go near. Giacomelli having been out for 7 years before that, and you know, like you say, Ed, he was a really competent driver. I thought what he did at Alfa Romeo in the early '80s was great, but this is an awfully long time on. I was trying to think of what a modern equivalent would be yesterday, and I kind of came up with, it would be like having a team called Thoughts, getting Heikki Kovalainen out of F1 retirement with a hexagon-shaped engine, run by people you've never heard of, and that's as realistic as this project seemed at the time.
The only person who comes out of the whole thing with any credibility is Bernd Schneider, who was offered the drive after Brabham left and turned it down, basically saying, "I'm not going anywhere near that one."
Well, he was fresh out of Zaxby's as well, which we'll touch on later. So he'd already had one. He'd obviously had a particularly miserable experience in '89, and then saw that and thought, "Gosh, as a team doing this even more incompetently than my previous employer did, I'm not going near that."
Yeah, credit to Bernd Schneider for making a good decision on that one. So, Matt, we're going to keep Ed away from the floor for a moment and throw this one over to you. We've gone from talking about some of the worst things to do with pre-qualifying. Let's have a little stats dive, shall we? Because there were some star drivers during pre-qualifying. I know you guys have crunched the numbers. So who do we want to give a shout out to? Who were maybe the best drivers in pre-qualifying, or just the ones who kept turning up?
I think Bertrand Gachot deserves praise for going through a full 41 pre-qualifying sessions.
Wow.
Which is impressive across 4 different teams, Onyx, Coloni, Jordan and Venturi, making it through 25 times. Had contentious, unusual splits with 2 of those teams as well, which is a nice little sort of side stat to add to that. Obviously, you've got some drivers who have 100% records of getting through pre-qualifying. Stefano Modena with Brabham in the first set of sessions. It's a really illustrious set of drivers did go through that. We mentioned Brundle and Modena, obviously. Michele Alboreto ended up in pre-qualifying only a year after racing for Ferrari. Having split with Tyrrell, he ended up in the Lola LaRousse project and then reappeared in pre-qualifying with footwork a little bit later in his career. Gabriele Tarquini, I'd shout to as a pre-qualifying hero. He did some really gallant work with an AGS that was never going to. That team by that time was in no shape to be in Grand Prix racing. Really, he only made it into the real qualifying session 14 times out of his 33 pre-qualifying appearances, but within a few years of that, he was an absolute hero in Super Touring. So it does show the caliber of driver who was getting stuck in those Friday morning sessions. But I think my ultimate pre-qualifying hero would be Roberto Moreno. His career trajectory was absolutely bonkers by this point anyway, in that he'd already made one Grand Prix attempt in 1982 with Lotus when he was massively unprepared, subbing for an injured Nigel Mansell. Didn't qualify on that occasion. Went back to the single-seater ladder. Was Formula 2 runner-up. Had a very brief IndyCar career first time around in the mid-80s and impressed in that. Still had no money. Came back to Europe. Eventually ended up winning Formula 3000 in 1988. Was testing for Ferrari at the same time, doing most of the donkey work on their semi-automatic gearbox. But then he spends most of his actual Grand Prix career at that period just trying to get Coloni's EuroBruns and later on an Andrea Moda onto the grid with limited success. He only makes it through pre-qualifying 8 times in 30 attempts. But then 1990 just showed what a quality driver he really was. You know, with EuroBrun eventually fell apart a few weeks before he got a call up to Benetton after Alessandro Nannini's terrible helicopter crash. And this driver who could barely get beyond Friday morning in the completely hopeless EuroBrun finished second in the Japanese Grand Prix in his first start with Benetton. So as a kind of ultimate measure of the sort of driver who was stuck in these sessions and a real hero for getting the cars into qualifying that he did, I'm going to give a nod to Moreno as the pre-qualifying star of the era.
Putting that EuroBrun 16th on the grid for the United States Grand Prix in 1990 was preposterous, just as his Monaco Andrea Moda performance was. I think Gabriele Tarquini also deserves a little bit of a mention.
I knew that was coming.
Well, no, I think if I was running a 1989 Formula One team and I wanted the best two drivers for qualifying, Moreno would be my first driver, and I'd have Gabriele Tarquini as my second one. Although he was the driver who failed to pre-qualify more than any other driver. Of course, he just had a horrendous sequence of cars in Formula One. Asella, Coloni. He was meant to race the first, but of course it didn't turn up in '89. Got that AGS seat. Did score a point with the AGS. Carried on with the AGS for 89 and 91. So a huge amount of time in struggling cars for him. But both, first-rate drivers. If you look at what they've done elsewhere, obviously Matt touched on Moreno. We saw how well Tarquini did in touring cars. A fantastic driver, still going strong to this day. So it underlines the fact there were actually some seriously good drivers turning up in terrible cars in pre-qualifying. So although there's the occasional no-hoper, most of them are actually pretty serious and could have done a formidable job in a proper car.
Well, it's got to be said, hasn't it? In any era of F1, really, particularly modern F1, there's always been more capable drivers than there have been seats, and that's the same today. If we ended up with 40 cars trying to get onto the grid today, we would find 40 decent drivers, or maybe 32 decent drivers and some pay drivers to fill them. It's just that back then these guys were good, but they were in terrible cars, and it didn't always do them justice. And poor old Moreno didn't even last a year at Benetton before he got booted out for a German chap called Schumacher. Let's move on to another team we want to talk about. And this is one that I look back on very fondly, Onyx. I think they were cool-looking cars, weren't around for very long, but had some very memorable moments and good results during their short existence. But in fairness, Ed, when they first appeared at the start of '89, they didn't look anything special at all.
Yeah, they struggled for the simple reason that they were so underprepared. They tried to set it up. This was Mike Earl, of course, who'd run Onyx in single-seater racing. Very serious person, ran a very proper team. They had Alan Jenkins in as designer, but they just weren't ready for the first race in '89. They got this influx of money. Bertrand Gachot, the driver, had brought in this Moneytron money from Jean-Pierre Van Rossum, who's one of the colourful character sponsors from this era. So I think a lot of people kind of shrugged them off and said, oh, they're not going to be very good because they just didn't have the car ready to run in Rio, despite the fact they took it to a kart track to run it around and try and get it to work. But, they had failures and bits falling off. And people were looking at it and thinking, oh, well, you've bitten off more than you can chew here, because the standard thing is you'd normally have undercooked, simple cars. But the Onyx, actually, Jenkins's car was a very well-designed, quite ambitious little car. But then as the season went on, after the first three races where it didn't pre-qualify, suddenly the car started finding this pace. And by the end of the first half of the season, actually the Onyx was becoming the quickest car in pre-qualifying, quicker even than the Brabham. Stefan Johansson got fifth in the French Grand Prix on merit. Gachot probably could have been sixth place there, but had a battery problem and had the lost time in the pits. And then you have this sensational performance in the Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril. Johansson was one of only two drivers ever to have finished on the podium after pre-qualifying in this era. They had a special qualifying engine, which they upgraded the oil system, I think it was, decided to do a no-stop strategy, and just Johansson drove a really good race, benefited from, obviously, Senna and Mansell came together in that race. Patrese was ahead, I think, and retired, and that's what promoted Johansson to third. But they got this incredible third place. The thing that's a real shame about Onyx is this was a very proper team that did a great job with huge potential. People look at it thinking this could be good, but of course, as often happened, the money started to fall apart. It ended up with Van Rossum owning all of the team at the end of the season. They had a falling out with Gachot, so Gachot got sacked and JJ Leto was brought in. Tried to do this Porsche engine deal, the one that Footwork eventually got, which on paper sounded great, but obviously that Porsche engine was not a great one. But gradually the team fell apart. It was sold to a Swiss former racer, Peter Monteverdi. but by then Mike Earl had gone and Jenkins sort of hung on trying to make the best of it. But it was such a shame because you did have something that could have grown into something. It could have done what Jordan did, I guess, in terms of coming in, new team, doing a credible job. But it just shows how many pitfalls there are, that even if you do a good job with your team, run it properly, do a car properly, you can still get tripped up by the fact there just isn't the money there, even if you merit it. But that third place in Estoril, that stands in history as just one of the most fantastic performances.
I think one of my lasting memories of Onyx is when Nigel Mansell used Senna getting held up by Johansson's Onyx in Hungary to complete that quite memorable 3 abreast pass. And I think afterwards Mansell said that Senna had got stuck behind the Moneytron. I always enjoyed Mansell calling it the Moneytron rather than the Onyx. But Matt, we had a brief mention of Zach Speed earlier with Bernd Schneider. This is a team with a serious motorsport pedigree before and after its time in Formula One, but it was struggling to find its feet in F1 in the late 1980s. So this boom in other backmarker teams for it to have to fight to get onto the grid, it couldn't have come at a worse time for Zach Speed, could it?
No, a big part of Zach Speed's struggle in the turbo era had been trying to build its own engine. So for 1989, it stopped that and got in a new one instead. But it went for Yamaha, which was a terribly bad decision because in this period in particular, Yamaha was terrible in Formula One. So it ended up just having countless failures. There was a story that they were timing the record for how little time an engine would last between switching on and blowing up, and at one stage it was 4 seconds on one particular unit. That created the statistic of Aguri Suzuki becoming the only driver ever to have a whole season of failing to pre-qualify. He was in the session every race in 1989, never got out of it. His teammate, Bernd Schneider, who, as we know from touring car racing, was an absolutely superb driver, he did manage to get the Zach Speed onto the grid twice. First of all in the Brazilian Grand Prix, and then after that it was another 7 months till he managed to get through pre-qualifying onto the grid again at the Japanese Grand Prix, Yamaha's home race. Sign of optimism at last, and the engine blows on lap 1.
I remember talking to him about that once, 'cause I think he can. I interviewed him to do his race of my life for Autosport, and I think he considered putting that qualifying lap down as the drive of his life. And then he told me about the heartache of it breaking down beforehand. I don't think Bernd Schneider's F1 career did justice to how good he was. Now, we've got this far into an episode talking about F1 backmarkers, and we haven't mentioned the backmarker that was an ever-present from 89 to 2005. And that's Minardi. Everybody loves Minardi. But we haven't mentioned them so far, Matt, because they never actually ended up in pre-qualifying, although they did come very close, didn't they?
Yeah, it's a brilliant pre-qualifying stat that Minardi never had to go through it once. It had been a fairly terrible team in the mid-1980s when it started, but it did score its first point in 1988, and that was enough to mean it didn't have to go through pre-qualifying in 89. But the first half of the season was fairly terrible reliability-wise in particular. It wasn't slow at that point. Pierluigi Martini was generally qualifying just outside the top 10.
It's a good car.
Yeah, as they prove later in the season, at Estoril, he even ended up leading. At the end of the season, his qualifying record was, I think, 5.43 in the last 3 Grand Prix of the season, and then he qualified second for Phoenix in 1990 opener. So Minardi was actually finding its feet and producing a decent little car at this point. But come Silverstone, with the likes of Brabham having had some good races, Rial moved up the order very impressively through a bit of luck in Phoenix. Some of the pre-qualifying teams were looking really good for escaping, and Minardi was in real trouble. But again, Martini qualified just outside the top 10, and this time the race went smoothly. He managed to get through to 5th. Now, that's the kind of result he could have got several other times earlier in that season, had the car held together. But the really impressive thing was that his teammate, Luis Perez Sala, who was basically rubbish, managed to pull off a 6th place under heavy pressure from, I think, Olivier Griard, another classic backmarker of the era. So Minardi out of nowhere with its one excellent driver. I think Martini was excellent. I think that's fair. Excellent for an underdog. Having some luck, and its rubbish second driver performing like a competent Grand Prix racer for the first time, perhaps only time in his F1 career. It did perhaps show that when the pre-qualifying did put teams under pressure like that, it was Onyx that was consigned to staying in pre-qualifying as a result of Minardi getting this points finish, and the two teams were parked together in the paddock that weekend. Onyx had some relatively okay cash behind it at that time, so had quite a swanky setup, and Minardi had everything you'd expect from, as little as you'd expect from Minardi. And Sala hanging on under pressure to get that sixth place at the end made all the difference, and the moods in the two very different motorhomes were opposite, according to reports from the time.
Yeah, so that's where we'll leave Minardi, because they never fell into the pit of pre-qualifying. Before we move on to some more great subjects, obviously these ramshackle operations quite often had shambolic reasons for not making the cut. So I'm going to ask you for your favourites, and we'll start with you, Ed. Which ones come to mind for you? And you can't list 20.
Yeah, I think one of my favourite ones was probably Bertrand Gachot, one of those who was in pre-qualifying a hell of a lot. Just that they'd rushed to get the Coloni ready for 1990, and they'd done a little shakedown ahead of the United States Grand Prix, and the gear linkage broke the second he was out of the pit lane. And those are the ones I like most. Just when you go to this Herculean effort in a misguided attempt to qualify for a race, and then just something falls apart instantaneously. It's cruel, but sort of funny.
Yeah, there's so many tales of something breaking on the very first lap out of the pits, wings falling off, wheels falling off, that sort of thing. I think my favourite for sheer hopelessness, the few tales of drivers effectively making their debut in an F1 car in pre-qualifying, and Naoki Hattori did that at Suzuka in 1991 with Coloni, was sent straight out having not driven the car before, spun off after 4 laps, and failed to pre-qualify a mere 18.8 seconds off the pace. But for sheer ludicrous misfortune, the actually quite good Eric van der Poel at Phoenix in 1991 with the Modena team, which was a sort of Lamborghini operation, he ended up 8 seconds off the pre-qualifying pace through little fault of his own. His engine had blown in his own car before he could do a proper lap. He ran back in the Arizona heat for the spare, and then wasn't allowed to come out of the pit lane because he was judged to have been too tall for the cockpit. His head was sticking out too far, and the officials felt that was unsafe. The team's spare tub simply wasn't big enough for a driver of Van der Poel's height, and that was the first time it had really cropped up.
I'm sure that wouldn't have been the only case of an unsafe car being allowed out onto the track in a pre-qualifying session. Now, you mentioned there that the Modena team was, in some ways you could consider it a Lamborghini works operation, and there's actually another tail end of what we could consider a works team taking part in pre-qualifying, which seems ludicrous, but pick up the story for us with Coloni and Subaru.
Yeah, well, Enzo Coloni's team had come into Formula One in '87, definitely on the record as enticed by the fat turbos were going to be banned. Coloni was a pretty handy junior single-seater team. They got some reasonable results in F3000 a year before. They had success in F3 winning the Italian Championship with Capelli, and then Subaru decided they wanted to come into Formula One, so they actually bought a control of the team in for 1990. They had Mottori Moderni, who had supplied Minardi with engines in the past, to work on a Subaru flat 12 engine, but it was just a disastrous project. The car was hugely overweight, for something like 140 kilos. It drank oil by the gallon, pretty much. So it was just a terrible, unwieldy car.
35 kilos of oil, I've been told by someone who's spoken to Paolo Coloni about this. So that's 35 of your 140 kilos. Just in oil.
Yeah, that just shows how far off being sensible the whole thing was, and inevitably the Coloni in 1990, despite having a good driver in Gachot, never got near qualifying. Had all sorts of problems. As I mentioned at Phoenix, had the gear linkage breaking, a gear change problem into Lagos, broken oil seal at Monaco. The engine failed instantly in France. Silverstone was only running on 10 cylinders, and then Subaru. Well, Subaru initially wanted to get rid of Enzo Coloni, so did. Then they decided they wanted to get rid of the team and sold it back to him, and they switched to a Ford engine, and were a bit better after that. But yeah, the whole thing was just a real mess. And of course, Coloni lumbered on for another year. They almost got Andrea de Cesaris actually for 91, but yeah, Coloni, they were basically in pre-qualifying throughout this whole spell. Had never had any real resource behind them, and just really struggled. But again, one of those charismatic teams, and Coloni, it's a very familiar racing team name. So of course the Coloni name continued in single-seater racing for a very long time after that.
Yeah, and probably repaired some of the damage to the name in terms of reputation, because they were certainly credible over the years that followed outside of F1. Now, Ed, we let Matt talk us through some of the stars of pre-qualifying. It only seems fitting that to go to the other end of the pre-qualifying statistics pile, we should come to you. So let's spare a moment for the less fortunate drivers who never made it through a pre-qualifying session.
Yeah, well, there are a handful who were basically considered Grand Prix drivers, but never got beyond early Friday morning. The most unfortunate was Claudio Langis, the Italian driver. A driver good enough to finish on the podium in F3000. He failed to pre-qualify 14 times in a EuroBrun. Pedro Chavez, another capable driver, 13 attempts in a Coloni. Joachim Winkelhock, obviously went on to be a touring car superstar. A very, very good driver. He had 7 attempts in the AGS in 1991 and was generally pilloried by people, but he didn't have a chance in a car that quality. Enrico Battaglia, a Macau Grand Prix winner, had 7 failed attempts to qualify in a Coloni, and then was briefly supposed to be in a Andrea Moda before being replaced. Perry McCarthy, another Andrea Moda driver. Gary Bradman, we've mentioned before, and Matt's favourite, Naoki Hattori. Hattori was another driver who knew how to turn a steering wheel. So it just shows that you get these people who are Grand Prix drivers, but they just did not have a chance. It would take a superhuman effort even to get close to getting through pre-qualifying, let alone hauling those cars on the grid. I've always liked these drivers because I remember having years ago the first edition of the book by Steve Small, the Grand Prix drivers, and there was a section at the back which was just about the drivers who never qualified for a race. And I was always fascinated by some of these. A lot of them you wouldn't have heard of, and I think that was probably the start of my fascination with those struggling at the back of Grand Prix grids, because there's always a story behind this, and again, all those drivers mentioned were perfectly capable of doing a perfectly effective job in a Grand Prix car, and some of them could have done much better than that. So yeah, what a cruel record. I wonder how it feels to have been someone who made it to F1 like Winkelhock, but never had a chance. You'd almost wonder if he'd rather have never made it rather than being this almost embarrassing footnote.
The fact that you said Winkelhock was pilloried, I think, as a massive super touring fan from the mid-90s, learning that Winkelhock's reputation in F1 was that bad, I found that quite offensive when I was catching up on this era.
I mean, Ed, you say that you wonder what it'd feel like to get to that many Grand Prix and never take part in one. Well, you've done far more than any of these guys did. So in a way, you achieved that goal of becoming one of these people. You're always at F1, but I never see you qualify.
Yeah, I've not qualified for a single race. I did in my very modest amateur fun Sunday race driving career have a few occasions where I did have to qualify, but normally I did quite well. Although my own contribution to hilarity, in a qualifying race in the Ginetta, I once started a race from well up the grid, thought just drive around, hold 4th place, get to the main race, started in neutral, last by the first corner. So I've got my own idiotic qualifying story.
Yeah, you'd have fit in very well in a Coloni or EuroBrun or maybe even a Life. I think they'd have all suited you.
I think the one thing I wouldn't have done was fit in any of those cars, unfortunately.
Now, we've mainly, since Brabham, which feels like a very long time ago now, we've mainly talked about rubbish pre-qualifying stories, but surely the best team to ever take part in pre-qualifying was Jordan, which was there for the first half of 1991 because it was a brand new entry. And the team went on to finish 5th in the Constructors' Championship that year, which is phenomenal for, firstly, considering it was brand new, and secondly, considering that it was part of this band of unlikely brothers that were the travelling circus that had to go out and be the opening act on a Friday morning. Now, of course, the Jordan 191, a gorgeous and very competitive Formula One car, was designed by our very own Gary Anderson. And Gary actually found pre-qualifying quite useful, even though at the first attempt, Jordan only got one of its cars through. So we had a quick word with Gary to get some insight into what it was like to take part in this session. And here's what he told us.
Being a new team coming into Formula One in 1991, pre-qualifying was pretty good for us because it gives us a little bit of a chance to try to get on top of things before actually the real weekend started. The biggest worry for us with pre-qualifying, I suppose, was the fact that the Pirelli tyre, we were using Goodyear tyres, and the Pirelli tyres, Pirelli themselves were allowing the teams to run, and they would bring them back in and they'd put them onto a sort of wheel balance machine and they'd clean up the surface of them. So they were able to run a sort of softer tyre than us. We had to wait to about the last 5 minutes of that 1 hour pre-qualifying before the track would be clean enough for the Goodyear tyre to really respond. At the beginning of the sessions, in the first 15 minutes of the run, hour running, you'd probably find yourself 2 and 3 seconds off any sort of pace. That would be lucky. And then as the session went by, you get to a point where you think, okay, now's the time, put on your second set of tyres and stand on the gas pedal, and that would be enough. But what it did do is give us an opportunity to sort of be a little bit ahead of the game. Although whenever 9 o'clock came on a Friday morning, you usually were feeling so burned out that you missed the next session or part of the next session anyway, just from the fact that you'd been through the stress of pre-qualifying. It was tough for the drivers, but we had a good record. Andrea didn't get through pre-qualifying at the first race in Phoenix because a camshaft sensor on the engine fell off basically on the back of one of the camshafts, so the engine didn't know where it was. Which was a bit unlucky, and he didn't get back in time to get in the spare car and all that sort of stuff. But we pre-qualified for all the rest of the races up to the British Grand Prix, and then we were out of pre-qualifying, which was a big relief. But at the end of the day, we missed that extra hour, I think, that didn't do any harm as long as you could get through pre-qualifying. If you imagine what it would have been like for Jordan, first Grand Prix in Phoenix, Arizona, all the way from Silverstone, from a lock-up shed in Silverstone, and if we hadn't got a car through pre-qualifying, we'd be out of there on Friday morning by 9 o'clock, and you'd have to go home because there wasn't room for anything. I had my 40th birthday there. Then, between my wife Jenny and Marie Jordan, they'd made a lovely cake for us. So it was a nice celebration to get one car through. The difficult part was just knowing when to use that second set of tyres. Pirelli kept cleaning up their tyres. Goodyear wouldn't do it. So Pirelli, in reality, they had 2 sets of tyres per car as well, but they probably had about 6 runs at doing a lap time. We had 2 sets of tyres per car, and we had 2 runs at doing a lap time. So you had to leave that last set of tyres for the last minute because that was when the track was going to be at its best. And also the pressure on don't go out and make a mistake because the track was still dirty. It would be very easy to go out and make a mistake, and that one or 2 laps that you had on those tyres would have been wasted. So, yeah, it was pressure, but as I say, it was one of those pressures that they're untold. I mean, it just happened so fast that session. I mean, it was 1 hour, bish bash bosh done, and you looked at it and thought, "Oh, we got through there, okay." And as I say, Andrea was a great asset during that period in time, but it helped us with understanding the car. We were out there and running, and got an extra hour into some of the other teams. So when we did have our act together and we got into the next session, we were usually pretty quick. I mean, we qualified well on a Friday on a lot of occasions due to that 1 hour extra. Saturday, then they might catch you a little bit more, but we did do a pretty decent job on the Friday for what we were.
Now, Ed, no one has probably spoken to Gary more about the way Jordan set itself up in 1991 than you. Maybe Eddie Jordan, but even then I'm not convinced. And I think Gary offers a different take there on the fact that if you were quick, having that extra hour of track time, particularly as a new team, could actually be quite useful for the rest of the weekend, because in some ways it was a head start on the rest of the guys you'd then be battling with for the rest of the weekend.
Yeah, it was extra track time, and usually it worked for Jordan with the exception of Phoenix. And I think that kind of reflects the kind of team that Jordan was, because we've got so many different teams came and went and fell apart. And Jordan, I mean, Gary himself will admit he didn't expect the team to come together when he was first asked to do it by Eddie Jordan, but through some just good, sensible work technically. I mean, when Gary first went to their lockup, basically, where they had the team running from, there was nothing in it, so literally had to start that from scratch, but with a little bit of engineering ingenuity and some good fundamentals, and then Eddie Jordan wheeling and dealing in the background to get money. And it shows that at this time you could still pull together a Grand Prix team and do a good job, and they made the most of the opportunities they got. I guess that mindset's probably part of it, isn't it? Don't look at pre-qualifying as a problem. Look at it as an opportunity. And it was a strong period as well, because Scuderia Italia, the Dellaras, were having to pre-qualify that year as well. And in fact, we mentioned Johansson's podium, but JJ Lesso got a podium that year. The last driver to pre-qualify, then get a podium at Imola. So, another very, very credible team. So if you did the job properly, you had half a chance of making something of yourself and actually getting onto the Formula One merry-go-round and making a good business out of it, as of course Eddie Jordan did.
So we've got the JJ Leto podium in there. For those of you using the bingo card that we put out on social media, you might have a full set by now. And if you don't have a full set, you're about to, because in 1992, There were 16 two-car teams entered, so that meant we still had pre-qualifying, but we only had that many cars because of the briefly previously mentioned, but now they get their own section, the shambolic Andrea Moda team, which had required the remains of Coloni that had failed to pre-qualify through 1990, despite the efforts of Gasho, as we previously mentioned. This was a team engulfed in shambles and controversy from the start. It tried to avoid the mandatory $100,000 entry deposit on the basis that it was a continuation of Coloni rather than a new team. F1 saw through that. The cars turned up in Kyalami and ran in the familiarization session because it was a new track for 1992, but then they weren't allowed to run again until they produced their own car. So that appeared in Brazil with what had once been a BMW design project carried out by Nick Worth's Simtech operation, the Moda S921. By this point, Roberto Moreno and Perry McCarthy were the unfortunate drivers when Alex Caffey and Enrico Battaglia had been in the cars briefly in South Africa. So the most memorable thing on track that this team ever managed had to be Moreno somehow not only getting through pre-qualifying, but getting onto the grid in Monaco, which is an achievement that I know Ed is in absolute awe of and probably thinks about on a daily basis. McCarthy managed 11 laps in total throughout the season, and I think if you ever Google pictures of him, you normally find him stood next to the car, sometimes even at the end of the pit lane. And once he was let out, or once he left the pit lane 30 seconds before the end of the session, which begs the question, what was the point? Later in the year, the bailiffs turned up in the Spa paddock and team owner Andrea Sassetti spent a night in jail. F1 had had enough of the whole saga by this point, and despite the team's attempts to run again at Monza, it wasn't allowed to. So by this point, we were down to 30 cars, which meant that although only 26 would get on the grid, there was no need for pre-qualifying to decide who would go through to the rest of the weekend. Ed, Andrea Moda, an incredibly famous team for all the wrong reasons, and really this was, I think, the final straw for F1 in that it knew it was moving into a direction where it had to distance itself from these sort of operations, didn't it?
Yeah, ever-growing professionalism. It was a big corporate entity by this stage. And fun as it is to have...
F1, not Andrea Moda.
Yes, yeah, very much F1. And fun as it is to have Roberto Moreno turning in probably the greatest qualifying performance in F1 history to get onto the grid. It's not a great look for Formula One. And also, it's not good for just the general Formula One ecosystem, because remember, these companies, these teams will use independent companies to do work for them, and sometimes things aren't paid. It's bad for drivers, it's bad for staff, everyone. So there does need to be a line drawn somewhere. Hilarious as something like Andrea Moda is. And there's also the safety issue, because there were problems with the chassis, particularly McCarthy was struggling with the steering column flexing and that kind of thing. So yeah, safety concerns as well, which obviously these days the crash tests and safety standards that are applied would tackle that. But yeah, there's a lot of downsides for what's a very small upside of general hilarity.
Yeah, a big part of me wants to say, no, let it happen all the time. We need more cars 20 seconds off the pace and having wheels falling off and stuff. But a team being simply rubbish and slow, but being plucky is lovable. A team being dangerous and its owners being legally dubious. Yeah, there's no need for that.
Yeah, so Andrea Moda, probably the last of these disastrous teams, as subsequently from this point, F1's regulations evolved to put a higher bar on entering F1 in the first place. The last time we had more than 26 cars entered was 1994, where the Pacific team was quite often the team that missed out, spending most of the season failing to make it onto the grid. And since then, we've had very rare cases of teams that weren't really ready for F1 trying to get in. And those teams are usually kept out by the 107% rule, which was brought in for 1996 as another way to scare off some of the chancers. We mentioned 94 there. In this era, we had across between 94 and by the middle of 96, we welcomed and lost Simtech, Pacific and 40, the last real band of rubbish F1 teams that gave it a go. The 107% rule, of course, meant that the terrible Lola project of 1997, which I promise you will get its own episode in the future, didn't get onto the grid, and the only attempt they made in Australia of that year. Those projects are all fascinating in their own way, so we will come back to them in a future episode. But Matt, looking at F1 today, not only has the bar been raised on track, but there's a very thorough evaluation process for new teams before they're even considered for an entry. They have to prove their financial and technical viability, and quite often we hear of teams try and leak information that they're trying to get onto the grid, and then you follow it up with, say, the FIA or F1 themselves, and you very quickly get told, no, we're not interested in them at all. So the chances are still out there, but all they can do is try and plant a story on the internet that they're trying to get an entry. Have we lost something because these teams don't make it to F1 anymore? Or, as you said before, is it okay if they're plucky and competent, but we can't let in teams that are perhaps a risk to F1 as a business, but also safe from a safety perspective on track?
I think that's the key thing. The plucky teams now would be a team that was doing well in Formula 2 or Formula 3 and thought, okay, I'll give F1 a go, like a Jordan, like even a Coloni further back as well. But all those teams doing well in the junior series right now are too sensible. They look at F1 and what it takes and how big they have to grow and the money involved, and they're not going to take that risk. So it only is the ludicrous chances trying to make it in, and I don't think their absence really hurts. I think the last two times we had like a clutch of small backmarker teams. You mentioned Simtech, Pacific, and 40, and then there was the 2010 gang of Lotus, Caterham, HRT, Virgin, Marussia, Manor, which was just three teams, despite having a lot of names between them over the course of their history. They were in
Not enough cylinders either.
True. They were all, both those groups, the 94, 95 group and the 2010 group, were so far off the back of the grid. They're in a battle of their own. Whereas at least with the pre-qualifying era, a lot of those teams could get into the race and be competitive and get on the podium. So it's not just the field spread. It was like 12 seconds covering from pole to the back of pre-qualifying in 1989 a lot of the time. It's this big gulf where it's like one group that's quite close, then a no man's land.
Yeah, and I think it's key what you said there is there are lots of competent teams in the junior ranks and in Formula 2 in particular at the moment, but you know the leap you need to become a real F1 team now, Ed, is just way beyond those teams that take a handful of people perhaps to races and run cars out of an awning usually around the back of the F1 paddock. The best example for me is ART, you know, a super team in the junior ranks in a lot of championships that I covered. And set up by Fred Vasseur, who now runs the Alfa Romeo F1 team. And Fred was constantly being asked, you know, when is ART going to go into F1? And if F1 makes it affordable, are you going to go there? And Fred was way too sensible. He knew that it would kill the team. And he's ended up as a leading F1 team boss because he's gone in and been hired. He was never going to take his own team there because, as you know very well, Ed, from what you see, you love a backmarker F1 operation, but F1 today is just beyond anyone being able to really create a startup and just turn up and, like Jordan did, sort of work your way through it in that first season.
Yeah, well, even for a good racing team that's operating in junior single seaters in F2, you can't scale up a team into Formula One. You have to. You might have a F2 team, and you might think I'm going to start an F1 team, but effectively you're starting a completely different team from scratch. It just doesn't work like that. So I think the current situation is correct in that you don't want any old chancer to throw a 5-year-old second-hand engine in a wheelbarrow and put a few wings on it and say that's a Formula One car. But it's a shame that the aspirational element isn't there. You don't want the existing teams to be diluted too much by splitting all the money that's available to them too much. But Formula One will benefit from it being possible for new teams to come in. The reason new teams can't come in isn't because really the door's slammed in their face. It's because it is so difficult. The amount of money you would need to start a Formula One team from scratch to have any chance of doing it is enormous. And the only way that we've seen it work in recent times is with the Haas team, which is, you know, it's 2/3 of a Formula One team. They've partnered with Dallara. They get a lot of stuff from Ferrari. So they've done it in a certain way. And you know, we don't have to look at it as Formula One's locking people out. We need to look at it as, well, Formula One needs to be a little bit more aware of how to get the costs increasingly under control so that it is possible for new people to come in, because teams tend not to go out of business, thankfully, so much anymore, but it can happen. They can be closed down. And Formula One is nothing really beyond those 10 teams that can make and run Grand Prix cars. Without that, they're nothing. So that's the lifeblood. And that was probably the positive thing that we saw about the 2010 influx, that we did see some manufacturers going out, and that at least kept grid numbers up, and in fact allowed the grid to grow a little bit in that period, although it was only a short-term fix.
Okay, well, Matt lost us a couple of cylinders when he mentioned those 2010 teams. Now we're talking about Haas coming in. So we've lost another 2 cylinders. We're limping round on 6 cylinders here. So I think it's time to bring this incredible look back at a bonkers era of F1 to an end. And I think, we say bonkers. I think in some ways it was charming as well. So we hope you've enjoyed a look back at the other end of the Formula One pit lane at the start of what we consider the V10 era. I don't think there are many V10 engines in pre-qualifying, to be fair. But if there's a story or a rubbish team that didn't get a mention there, make sure you get your questions in for our series finale. Use the hashtag Bring Back V10s and make sure you tag @WeAreTheRace. We're picking them up as they come in, and we'll do another big push to make sure we get as many as possible. And but we've got one more episode until then, and it's going to be taking us back to the end of 1994 when it was Michael Schumacher versus Damon Hill for the World Championship, the final few races of that season, which of course culminates in a controversial finish on the streets of Adelaide.